The three men dangled like broken marionettes against the rising sun, their shadows stretching across Redemption's main street. A crowd had gathered, some solemn, others with the hungry eyes of those who feast on others' misery. Mason Ridge stood at the back, hat pulled low, the collar of his worn Confederate greatcoat turned up despite the Texas heat. He knew those men, not as friends, but as brothers forged in the crucible of Gettysburg. 12 years had passed since that blood-soaked field, but Mason recognized the faces beneath the hoods. Peterson, Wilkins, and Taylor, the last of his unit besides himself. The executioner, a large man with a butcher's hands, read the charges. Robbery of the Redemption Federal Bank and Trust. Murder of 2 guards. Mason's jaw tightened. Lies. These men hadn't robbed anything. They were being hanged for the crime of wearing gray a decade ago for surviving when so many others didn't. From the balcony of the newly constructed bank building, General Harrison Wade observed the proceedings with cold satisfaction. His tailored suit and silver watch chain spoke of wealth, but his rigid posture betrayed the military man beneath. At 55, the former Union general had exchanged his blue uniform for banker's clothes, but the war still lived in his eyes. Those eyes found Mason in the crowd. Recognition flickered between them, predator acknowledging predator across a crowded hunting ground. Wade's thin lips curled upward as the trap door opened beneath Taylor's feet. Mason turned away. He'd seen enough men die. He pushed through the crowd, ignoring the muttered curses as he shouldered past. His spurs rang against the wooden boardwalk, a metronome counting steps away from a past that refused to stay buried. "Ridge!" The voice stopped him at the hitching post where his dappled gray stallion waited. Mason's hand instinctively moved to the Remington revolver on his hip. Sheriff Hayes approached, thumbs hooked in his belt. A tin star gleamed on his chest, polished bright as fool's gold. "Didn't expect to see you in town." "Supplies?" Mason said, voice gravel rough from disuse. 3 Confederate boys get themselves hanged, and suddenly you appear." Hayes stepped closer. His breath smelled of cheap whiskey and expensive cigars. "Coincidence." "Just like it's coincidence Wade hired you after you testified against those men." Mason tightened the cinch on his saddle. Hayes's hand drifted toward his gun. "Careful, Ridge. War's over. Your side lost." "And yet some keep fighting." Mason swung into the saddle, looking down at Hayes. "Tell the general if he wants my land, he'll have to take it the same way he took everything else. With blood." He rode out of Redemption as the church bell tolled 9 times 3 for each dead man. The town had been called Hope when he'd first passed through in '65. The irony of its new name wasn't lost on him. The trail back to his cabin wound through rocky hills and sparse mesquite. Mason let his horse pick the path, while his mind circled back to Wade. The general had been methodically eliminating former Confederates from the county, foreclosing farms, denying loans, arranging accidents. Now he'd graduated to public hangings. Mason's cabin appeared as the sun reached its zenith, a simple structure of timber and stone nestled against the base of a limestone ridge. No neighbors for 10 miles, just as he preferred. The war had taught him to value solitude over company. He dismounted stiffly, the old wound in his thigh protesting the ride. Inside, he lit the stove and put coffee on to boil. The cabin's single room held little: a narrow bed, a rough-hewn table with a single chair, a shelf of dog-eared books. On the wall hung a faded daguerreotype of a woman and child, Sarah and James. His wife had succumbed to fever in '67. His son followed 6 months later. Or so he'd been told. The coffee was just beginning to simmer when he heard it, hoofbeats, multiple riders approaching fast. Mason grabbed his Winchester .73 and stepped onto the porch. 5 riders crested the rise to the north, pushing hard. 4 men and something else. They were dragging a figure behind the last horse. A woman, by the looks of her, bound by the wrists. Even at this distance, Mason could see the bright splashes of blood on her buckskin dress. As they drew closer, he recognized Wade's foreman, Sullivan, leading the group. The woman was native Comanche by her dress. Her face was a mask of dirt and blood, but she was conscious, eyes burning with defiance as she stumbled and was dragged when she couldn't keep pace. Mason stepped back into the shadows of the porch. This wasn't his fight. He'd learned the hard way that intervening only brought more trouble. Let them pass by. But they weren't passing by. Sullivan led his men directly toward Mason's cabin, only stopping when they reached the clearing in front. "Ridge," Sullivan called out. "Got a runaway here. Seen any others?" Mason stepped forward, rifle held casually but ready. "You're on my land, Sullivan." Sullivan spat a stream of tobacco juice. "Wade's land soon enough. This one," he jerked his head toward the woman, "escaped with some valuable property. There might be others." "Don't see any property," Mason said, eyes flicking to the woman. Her dark eyes met his, revealing no fear, only calculation. "Just looks like you're dragging a woman to death." "She's Comanche," Sullivan said, as if that explained everything. "Wade paid good money for her. She knows where to find something he wants." Mason's gaze hardened. "Slavery ended with the war, Sullivan, even for Indians." "This ain't slavery, it's justice." Sullivan nodded to his men. "We'll just water our horses at your creek, then be on our way." They dismounted purposefully, spreading out. Mason recognized the maneuver. He'd used it himself in the war. Surround, then close in. "Creek's downstream," Mason said, gesturing with his rifle barrel. "That way. Off my property." Sullivan's face darkened. "You turning against your own kind, Ridge, for a savage." "My kind died at Gettysburg," Mason replied. "And again, this morning, in redemption." "Wade said you might be difficult." Sullivan drew his revolver. "Said we should bring you in too, if you—" The Winchester barked once. Sullivan's hat flew off a neat hole punched through the crown. The horses spooked, including the one the woman was tied to. As it bolted, she twisted in her bonds, somehow managing to get a foot into the stirrup. With a desperate heave, she pulled herself onto the horse's back, hands still bound to the saddle horn. "Next one opens your skull," Mason said evenly. Sullivan froze, but his men were already reaching for their weapons. Mason fired twice more, one bullet splintering a man's shoulder, another striking a horse that reared and threw its rider. The woman kicked her stolen mount into a gallop, heading east toward the ridge. Sullivan, recovering his nerve, fired at her retreating form. The shot went wide, but the second man got off a better aim. The woman jerked in the saddle, but kept riding. Mason squeezed the trigger again, and Sullivan's gun hand erupted in blood. The foreman screamed, clutching his mangled fingers. "Get off my land," Mason said, levering another round into the chamber. "Now!" The men retreated, Sullivan cursing Mason with promises of return. Mason watched until they disappeared over the rise, then turned his attention to the direction the woman had fled. Blood on the rocks told him Sullivan's man had scored a hit after all. He found her 3 miles east, collapsed beside a stand of cottonwoods, the horse grazing nearby. An arrow of crimson stained the side of her buckskin dress where the bullet had grazed her ribs. Her wrists were raw and bleeding from the ropes. Mason knelt beside her. She was perhaps 26, with high cheekbones and obsidian eyes that opened as he approached. Despite her injuries, she lunged at him with a small knife she'd somehow concealed. He caught her wrist, noting with grudging respect that she'd managed to partially cut through her bonds. "Easy," he said. "I'm not with them." She spat words in Comanche, then switched to accented English. "You are white. You are with them." "I just shot at them," he reminded her. "You're bleeding." She glanced at her side, unconcerned. "I have had worse." Mason sheathed his knife and raised empty palms. "I can help or leave. Your choice." The woman stared at him, weighing his words against her options. Finally, she nodded once. "Help now, kill later if you betray." A ghost of a smile touched Mason's lips. "Fair enough." He cut through her remaining bonds and helped her onto his horse, then led them back to his cabin by a circuitous route that would confuse any pursuit. She said nothing during the journey, though he could tell by her shallow breathing that the wound pained her more than she let on. At the cabin, he helped her inside and onto his bed, then gathered what he needed to tend her wound. The bullet had cut a furrow along her ribs, painful, but not deadly, if infection could be prevented. "Need to clean this," he said, holding up a bottle of whiskey. "Will hurt." She nodded, bracing herself. When the liquor hit the wound, she made no sound, only a slight tensing of her jaw, betraying her pain. Mason worked quickly, cleaning and bandaging the injury with the efficiency of a man who'd done this too many times before. "You have healer hands," she observed when he finished. "Battlefield, Gettysburg," he confirmed. "Too many wounded, not enough surgeons." She studied him with new interest. "You fought in white man's war. Against which tribe?" "The blue coats. I wore gray." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "The defeated ones." Mason's mouth tightened. "Some would say so." "No shame in defeat against greater numbers," she said. "Only in surrender." He looked at her, sharply struck by how closely her words echoed what his commander had said the day they'd faced Union forces 3 times their size. "What's your name?" he asked. "To my people, I am Nadua." "I'm Mason Ridge." She nodded solemnly. "Mason Ridge, who kills his own kind for a Comanche woman." "Why?" He busied himself putting away the medical supplies. "Those men aren't my kind. Not anymore." "They hunt me because I know things Wade wants," she said. "Things about sacred places, gold." Mason wasn't surprised. Wade's greed was well known. "Why were you with them in the first place?" A shadow passed over her face. "I was taken as child, raised among whites. When my adopted family died, Wade claimed me as property." Her voice hardened on the last word. "Said I belonged to him by right." "No one belongs to anyone," Mason said. "Not anymore." She watched him move about the cabin, her gaze calculating. "You saved me from certain death," she finally said. "By Comanche law, I now belong to you." Mason stopped, turning to face her. "I just said, not as slave," she interrupted. "As wife. This is our way. You save life, I give life in return." Mason stared at her, caught off guard. "That's not how things work here." "It is how things work for me," she insisted. "I have nowhere to go. My people would not accept me, now I am too white in my ways. Other whites would return me to Wade. You are neither." "I'm offering shelter until you're healed," Mason said firmly. "Nothing more." She nodded, accepting this for now, though something in her eyes told him the matter wasn't settled in her mind. "Wade will come for me. For you too now. Let him try." Mason checked his Winchester, making sure it was fully loaded before setting it by the door. "Get some rest. We'll talk more when you're stronger." Nadua closed her eyes, her breathing soon evening out into sleep. Mason sat in his chair watching the rise and fall of her chest, wondering what chain of events he'd just set in motion. He'd managed to stay out of Wade's way for years by keeping to himself. Now he'd shot the man's foreman and taken in a woman Wade considered his property. The war, it seemed, wasn't as over as he'd thought. As twilight descended, Mason stepped outside to check his perimeter. The dying light painted the limestone ridge in hues of amber and blood. A fitting sky for a day when men had died and new battle lines had been drawn. He scanned the horizon, seeing nothing but the familiar landscape of scrub and rock. But as he turned to go back inside, a flash of reflected light caught his eye from the distant hills, a spyglass or rifle scope. Someone was watching. Wade hadn't waited long to send his men back. Mason ducked into the cabin and barred the door. Nadua was awake, sitting up in the bed. "They're coming," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," he confirmed, gathering ammunition from a trunk. "Soon." Her eyes gleamed in the lamplight. "Then we fight together, or die apart, Mason Ridge. This is the way of the frontier." In the distance, the first gunshot split the night like thunder before a storm. Mason extinguished the lamp with one quick breath, plunging the cabin into darkness. Through the window, he could make out the silhouettes of riders approaching, at least 6 men moving with military precision. "Can you shoot?" he asked Nadua, passing her his Remington. She checked the cylinder with practiced ease. "Since I was 12. Mason raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He'd known white women who could handle firearms, but it was uncommon. For a Comanche woman raised among settlers, it was even more unusual. "Wade's men will try to burn us out," he said, positioning himself by the north window. "When the shooting starts, aim for the ones with torches first." Nadua moved to the opposite window, favoring her injured side, but otherwise steady. "Wade does not want me dead," she said. "He needs what I know. He might have changed his mind after I shot Sullivan." The riders halted just beyond effective rifle range. Mason recognized Sullivan among them, his hand wrapped in a bloody bandage. Another man, taller than the rest, nudged his horse forward. "That's not Sullivan leading them," Mason muttered. "That's Jessup." "Who is Jessup?" Nadua asked, never taking her eyes from the window. "Colonel William Jessup, my former commanding officer." Before Mason could explain further, Jessup's voice boomed across the clearing. "Mason Ridge, come out and parley." Mason hesitated, then cracked the door. "Say your piece from there, Colonel." "Is that any way to greet your old commander, son?" Jessup's voice carried a practiced warmth that didn't reach his eyes. "We rode through hell together at Gettysburg." "That was a long time ago," Mason replied. "Last I heard, you were heading to California." "Plans change." Jessup dismounted, approaching slowly with his hands visible. "I've got a business proposition for you." Mason kept his Winchester trained on Jessup's chest. "Does your business involve the woman you're hunting?" Jessup stopped his weathered face, revealing nothing. "So she is with you. Wade said you'd interfered." He sighed heavily. "This complicates matters. Wade's not getting her back." "This isn't about Wade," Jessup said. "It's about what's ours by right. The spoils that were denied us." Mason's grip tightened on his rifle. "I'm not interested in your war reparations fantasies, Colonel." "Not fantasies, son. Gold. Spanish gold hidden in these hills. The Comanche woman knows where." Jessup gestured toward the cabin. "Let me talk to her. We can cut you in. 1/3 share." "She's not property to be traded." Jessup's face hardened. "Don't tell me you've gone soft for a savage. After what they did to settlements all across Texas, she's done nothing to me except bleed on my floor." "And what about what was done to us?" Jessup pressed. "To the south, to your family." He took another step forward. Wade will get what he wants, with or without us. Better we take it first. For the cause. The cause died at Appomattox, Mason said flatly. Go back to Wade. Tell him my land's not for sale, and neither are the people under my protection. Jessup stared at him for a long moment, disappointment etched in the lines of his face. You've changed, Ridge. War does that. Indeed it does. Jessup turned to go, then paused. Wade's offering $500 for the woman. $1,000 if she's alive enough to talk. His eyes gleamed in the moonlight. He'll pay twice that for your land once you're not around to object. Mason's finger tightened on the trigger. You've got 10 seconds to clear my property, Colonel. Jessup mounted his horse with the fluid grace of a lifelong cavalryman. The war's not over for some of us, son. It just moved west. He tipped his hat. We'll be seeing you. The riders departed, dust rising behind them like wraiths in the moonlight. Mason watched until they disappeared over the ridge, then secured the door. You did not shoot, Nadua observed. He was my commanding officer. He is your enemy now. Mason checked the windows, ensuring they were barred. There's a line between enemy and betrayer. Jessup hasn't crossed it yet. Nadua studied him with those dark, measuring eyes. You are a man of honor in a land without it. She said it not as a compliment, but as a diagnosis. This will get you killed. Probably, he agreed. But we've got more immediate problems. Wade won't wait long to try again, and Jessup knows all my defenses. We cannot stay here, she concluded. No, come dawn, we ride for Copper Creek. What is in Copper Creek? A friend, maybe the only one I have left. They departed before sunrise. Mason leading them through a labyrinth of dry washes and narrow canyons where pursuing riders would be forced into single-file easy targets for a man who knew the land. Nadua rode behind him on a paint mare he kept as a spare sitting straight, despite her wound eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. How long have you lived here? She asked during a brief stop to rest the horses. 7 years, Mason replied, checking the horizon through a battered spyglass. After my wife and son died, I needed somewhere away. From memories, from people. He collapsed the spyglass with a snap. Memories follow wherever you go. Nadua nodded understanding in her eyes. My people say memories are like shadow people always walking beside us. Cannot escape, only learn to walk with them. Mason mounted up, signaling it was time to move on. What memories are walking beside you? She was silent for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was stripped of emotion. My father was war chief. My mother was medicine woman. Raiders came when I was 8 winters, killed many, took me and others. I was given to missionary family. They gave me white name, white God, white ways. What was your white name, Rebecca? She pronounced it carefully as if the name belonged to someone else. Rebecca Lawson, daughter of Thomas and Mary Lawson, God-fearing Baptists. What happened to them? Fever took them 3 moons ago. Wade came after, said they owed debts, said I was payment. Her face darkened. He learned I had lived among Comanche as child, thought I knew secrets about sacred places, about gold. Do you? She met his gaze steadily. Yes. The trail narrowed as they entered a limestone gorge, forcing them to ride single file. Mason took the lead, Winchester balanced across his saddle horn, ready for ambush. The only sounds were the clop of hooves on stone and the distant cry of a hunting hawk. Why does Wade want the gold so badly? Mason asked over his shoulder. Man's already rich. Not gold only, Nadua replied. Maps, old Spanish maps showing true boundaries of tribal lands, proving what was stolen. Mason frowned. Maps wouldn't stand up in any court. No, but they would unite tribes, give them claim under old treaties with Spain that came before American ones. She paused. Wade plans railroad through tribal lands. Maps would stop him. The pieces clicked into place in Mason's mind. Wade's methodical land acquisitions, the sudden interest in remote properties like Mason's that seemed worthless on the surface. The general was building an empire on stolen land, and anything or anyone that threatened it had to be eliminated. That explains why he's so determined to find you, Mason said. You're the only person who knows where these maps are. Not only person, Nadua corrected. Only one still alive. The gorge opened onto a rolling prairie dotted with mesquite and prickly pear. In the distance, thin columns of smoke rose from the cluster of buildings that made up Copper Creek, a settlement too small to be called a town, but too stubborn to remain a camp. As they approached, Mason noted the changes since his last visit 2 years ago. The general store had expanded, and a proper saloon had replaced the canvas tent that had served whiskey to dusty cowboys. A half-built church stood at the edge of town, its steeple reaching skyward like a finger pointing to salvation. Mason directed them to a weathered building with peeling paint and a sign that simply read, Cooper's. He dismounted, wincing as his bad leg took his weight, and helped Najwa down from her horse. "Friend of yours?" she asked, nodding toward the building. "Daniel Cooper. Served together in the war. Only man from my unit I trust completely." "Except Jessup," she noted. Mason's expression hardened. "Except Jessup." The saloon's interior was dim after the bright sunlight smelling of tobacco, whiskey, and wood smoke. A few early patrons hunched over tables nursing hangovers or plotting the day's business. Behind the bar stood a broad-shouldered man with a magnificent walrus mustache and an empty left sleeve pinned at the shoulder. Daniel Cooper's face split into a grin when he spotted Mason. "Well, I'll be damned. The ghost of Gettysburg rides again." He came around the bar, clasping Mason's hand in a firm grip. "Thought you'd turned hermit for good." "Almost did," Mason admitted. "Need your help, Daniel." Cooper's gaze shifted to Najwa, taking in her buckskin dress, her erect posture, and the barely concealed suspicion in her eyes. "I can see that. Come on back to my office before someone notices your companion." He led them through a door behind the bar into a small room that served as both office and living quarters. Maps and newspaper clippings covered one wall, centered around a detailed survey of the county. Cooper locked the door behind them and gestured for them to sit. "Wade's men came through here yesterday," he said without preamble, "asking about a Comanche woman and any strangers who might be helping her, offering rewards for information." "We had a visit too," Mason replied. "Jessup's riding with Wade now." Cooper's bushy eyebrows shot up. "The Colonel, well, that's a damn betrayal if I ever heard one. Man used to say he'd rather cut off his remaining arm than break bread with Yankees." "War changes some men," Mason said. "Peace changes them more." Cooper poured 3 glasses of whiskey, sliding them across the desk. "So what's Wade want with your lady friend here?" "Maps," Nadua answered, leaving her whiskey untouched. "Spanish maps showing true boundaries of tribal lands before American treaties." Cooper let out a low whistle. "Well, that'd put a crimp in the general's plans, wouldn't it? He's been buying up land all through the territory for that railroad of his." Mason leaned forward. "What railroad?" "Southern Pacific's new spur line. Wade's got the contract to secure right-of-way from here, clear to El Paso." Cooper tapped a red line drawn on his wall map. "Most folks are selling cheap after the drought last year. Those who won't sell have been having accidents. Like the men they hanged in Redemption, Mason said grimly. Wasn't much of a trial, Cooper agreed. Sheriff's in Wade's pocket now. Judge too, probably. Nedua stood moving to examine the map. This railroad crosses Comanche burial grounds here, she said, pointing to a spot near the Rio Grande. And sacred hunting lands here, places protected by old Spanish treaties. Treaties no court would honor now, Cooper said. Unless there was proof, Mason added. Proof that Wade's trying to destroy. Cooper's face grew serious. You're diving into deep waters, Mason. Wade's got the money and the connections to bury you both. He'll try regardless, Mason replied. We need a safe place to hole up until Nadua recovers fully. Then we need to find those maps before Wade does. I've got a hunting cabin up in the Guadalupes, Cooper offered. Not much, but it's defensible and off any trail Wade would know about. He hesitated. But you won't make it out of town if Sullivan spots you. He's been drinking at the Bluebird since noon yesterday, waiting for word from his men. Mason cursed under his breath. How many with him? 4 last I counted, mean-looking bunch. Texas Rangers badges that I'd bet my other arm are counterfeit. A plan began forming in Mason's mind. We'll need supplies, ammunition, food for at least 2 weeks. Cooper nodded. I can get that together. But there's another problem. He glanced at Nadua. No offense, ma'am, but you stand out. Every bounty hunter and opportunist between here and San Antonio will be looking for a Comanche woman traveling with a tall Confederate. I have solution, Nadua said. She untied her long braid, letting her black hair fall loose around her shoulders. I need white woman's clothes and scissors. Mason raised an eyebrow, but didn't object. Cooper disappeared briefly, returning with a bundle of fabric and a pair of shears. My late wife's, he explained. Never could bring myself to get rid of them. Nadua took the items with a respectful nod. I will return soon. When she emerged from Cooper's back room 20 minutes later, both men stared in shock. Gone was the Comanche woman in buckskin. In her place stood a respectable frontier wife, in a calico dress, her hair cut short, in the current style, her bronze skin partially concealed by a bonnet and shawl. Only her obsidian eyes remained unchanged, fierce and proud, beneath the demure exterior. Good God, Cooper breathed. If I didn't know better, I'd take you for a settler's wife myself. I lived as Rebecca Lawson for 15 years, she said simply. I remember how to wear the mask. Mason felt a new respect for her adaptability. It'll work. We'll pose as husband and wife traveling to visit family in El Paso. Cooper turned to his desk, pulling out papers. You'll need these. Marriage certificate deed to property in El Paso County. Had them made up for another purpose, but they'll serve. Mason examined the documents. Mason and Rebecca Taylor. He looked up sharply. Named after one of our boys they hanged yesterday, Cooper confirmed grimly. Seemed fitting. A shout from the saloon interrupted them, the crash of a chair followed by angry voices. Cooper moved to the door, cracking it open to peer into the main room. Sullivan, he hissed, and he's liquored up mean. Must have gotten word of Jessup's failed parley. Mason checked his Remington. Back door, Cooper shook his head. Faces the main street. They'd see you for sure. He glanced around the room, eyes landing on a trapdoor in the corner. Cellar. There's a tunnel leads to the livery stable. Dug it during the war when Confederate gold shipments needed hiding. He lifted the heavy door, revealing a ladder descending into darkness. I'll have your supplies and horses waiting at the other end. Take the canyon trail north. It's not on any map Wade would have. Mason clasped Cooper's shoulder. I owe you. You saved my life at Gettysburg, Cooper replied. Consider this partial payment. He handed Mason a folded paper. Map to the cabin. And, Mason? His voice dropped. If you find these Spanish documents, don't bring them back here. Take them straight to Judge Keller in Austin. He's the only honest federal judge left in Texas. The sound of breaking glass came from the saloon, followed by Sullivan's slurred voice, demanding to search the premises. Cooper pushed them toward the trap door. Go. I'll stall them. Mason helped Nadua onto the ladder, then followed, pulling the trapdoor closed above them. In the pitch darkness, they descended carefully, feeling their way along the earthen tunnel. The sounds of confrontation above faded, replaced by the oppressive silence of the underground passage. Your friend will be in danger, Nadua whispered. Cooper can handle himself, Mason replied, though concern edged his voice. He survived Pickett's charge with one arm. Sullivan's nothing compared to that. They emerged into the livery stable 20 minutes later, blinking in the sudden light. As promised, 2 horses waited, saddlebags bulging with supplies. Mason helped Nadua mount, then swung into his own saddle, leading them out the back way toward the canyon trail. They had just reached the edge of town when gunfire erupted behind them. Mason turned in the saddle to see smoke rising from Cooper's saloon, flames licking at the windows. His hand tightened on the reins, torn between escape and going back for his friend. We cannot help him by dying, Nadua said, reading his thoughts. Honor his sacrifice by surviving. Mason knew she was right, but the knowledge sat like acid in his gut as they rode away from Copper Creek, the sounds of chaos fading behind them. They rode hard for 3 hours, following the twisting canyon trail deeper into the hill country. The terrain grew increasingly rugged, with limestone cliffs rising on either side and scrub oak clinging to the rocky soil. When they finally stopped to rest, the horses, Mason's leg was throbbing, the old wound protesting the punishing pace. Nadua dismounted gracefully despite her injury, immediately scanning their surroundings. We are being followed, she said quietly. Mason tensed. How do you know? Dust on the horizon. And this. She held out her palm, showing him a small metal object. Found it caught in my saddle. Tracking device. Mason examined the item, a U.S. Army cavalry tracker's button designed to leave a trail only other trackers would recognize. It was a technique he'd seen used to follow deserters during the war. Jessup, he growled, must have planted it while we were in Cooper's. Nadua was already removing her saddle, checking every inch of leather and cloth. No more trackers on mine. Mason did the same, finding nothing on his gear. We need to change course. They'll be expecting us to follow the canyon. There, Nadua pointed to a narrow deer trail leading up the canyon wall. It will be difficult with horses, but possible. Mason studied the steep path, then nodded. Let's move. They led the horses up the treacherous incline, loose rocks skittering beneath their feet. Near the top, Mason's bad leg buckled. He would have fallen if Nadua hadn't caught his arm, steadying him with surprising strength. Old wound pains you, she observed. Mini-A ball at Gettysburg. He grunted. Shattered the bone. Doctor wanted to take the leg, but I wouldn't let him. Brave. Foolish, but brave. They crested the ridge as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. From their vantage point, they could see for miles the winding canyon below, the distant smudge of Copper Creek, and far to the east, the faint outline of Redemption. No pursuers were visible, but Mason knew Jessup would be reading the signs, following their trail with the patience of a seasoned hunter. They needed to reach Cooper's cabin before nightfall. How far to safe place? Nadua asked, remounting her horse. Mason consulted Cooper's map. 6 miles north. There's a hidden valley beyond that next ridge. They rode in silence, conserving their strength and watching for signs of pursuit. As they crossed a shallow stream, Mason noticed Nadwa wince, one hand pressed to her side. "Wounds opened up," he said. She shook her head. "I am fine." "You're bleeding through your dress." Nadua glanced down at the spreading crimson stain. "We stop when we reach cabin. Not before." Mason admired her stoicism, but worry gnawed at him. Fever from an infected wound could kill as surely as a bullet. They pushed on as the light faded, navigating by the rising moon and Cooper's hastily drawn map. The cabin appeared just as full darkness settled, a low, sturdy structure of logs and stone nestled against a cliff face. A natural spring bubbled nearby, and a small corral stood empty beside a lean-to stable. Mason helped Nadua dismount, supporting her weight as they entered the cabin. Inside was simple but well-provisioned, a stone fireplace, a table with chairs, shelves stocked with preserved food, and two narrow beds. Cooper had prepared for visitors, though perhaps not under these circumstances. While Mason tended the horses, Nadua built a fire and examined the supplies. By the time he returned, she had water heating and bandages laid out. "Let me see that wound," he said, lighting a lamp. She hesitated, then carefully removed the blood-stained dress, revealing the makeshift bandage beneath. Mason unwrapped it gently, revealing an angry red gash that had indeed reopened during their flight. "Needs stitching," he said, reaching for Cooper's medical kit. Nadua nodded, watching as he threaded a needle. "You have done this before." "Too many times." He cleaned the wound with whiskey, his touch clinical, yet careful. "This will hurt." "Pain is teacher," she replied. "Shows we are still alive." Mason worked quickly, placing neat stitches to close the wound. Nadua remained still throughout her breathing, controlled only the occasional tension in her jaw, betraying her discomfort. "Why do you help me?" she asked suddenly. "Truth, not honor talk." Mason tied off the last stitch before answering. "When I came back from the war, everything was gone. My home, my family's plantation, everything my father and grandfather had built." He wrapped a fresh bandage around her ribs. "Then I lost Sarah and James. After that, I stopped caring about much of anything. But you care now. Wade and men like him took everything from me once. I won't let them do it again." He secured the bandage and sat back. "And I won't let them take everything from you either." Nadua studied him, her dark eyes unreadable in the lamplight. "My people have story. When Great Spirit made first man and woman, he gave them choice. Live forever alone, or live short time together. They chose together." She pulled on a clean shirt from Cooper's supplies. "You chose alone. Until now." Before Mason could respond, a sound froze them both, the distant whinny of a horse. He doused the lamp, immediately moving to the window with his Winchester. Outside, moonlight silvered the landscape, casting deep shadows among the scrub oak and juniper. At first, he saw nothing. Then, a movement caught his eye. A figure slipping from one shadow to another, approaching the cabin with the stealth of a predator. "One man," he whispered. "Scout, probably." Nadua joined him at the window, Remington in hand. "Others will be close. If he reports our position, we're trapped." She nodded once, decision made. "I will draw him away. You take him." Before Mason could object, she was moving silently to the back door. He wanted to stop her, to insist on taking the risk himself, but he recognized the logic. She could move more quietly, and his skill with a rifle would be their best chance. Mason positioned himself by the window, rifle braced against the frame. Outside, Nadua ghosted from shadow to shadow, a flicker of movement barely distinguishable from the night breeze stirring the brush. The scout, a tall man with a cavalry hat, sensed rather than saw her movement. He turned, drawing his pistol. Nadua deliberately stepped into a patch of moonlight, then darted behind a boulder. The scout followed cautiously, moving into Mason's line of sight. Mason exhaled slowly, squeezing the trigger with practiced precision. The Winchester barked once. The scout crumpled without a sound, his body folding into the shadow of a juniper. Nadua emerged from cover, checking the fallen man before retrieving his weapons. When she returned to the cabin, her expression was grim. "Comanche," she said, placing the dead man's knife on the table. "Not white man." Mason examined the blade, distinctive with its bone handle and curved edge. "Wade's hired Comanche trackers." "No," Nadua's voice was tight. "This man is Blue Snake, from my father's band." The implications landed like a physical blow. "Your own people are hunting you, not my people anymore." Her face hardened. "Wade has found my band, threatened them or paid them. Does not matter which." She met his gaze directly. "Now we face enemies on all sides." Mason checked his ammunition mind, racing through their options, each more desperate than the last. Outside, an owl called 3 times, then twice more. Not an owl at all, but a signal. "How many in your father's band?" he asked, moving to barricade the door. 20 warriors. Best trackers among all Comanche bands." Mason's heart sank. Even with Cooper's well-provisioned cabin, they couldn't withstand a siege against those odds. "We need to move. Now." "No," Nadua shook her head firmly. "They will expect that. We stay." "That's suicide. Trust me." She reached into her pack, withdrawing a small pouch. "I will speak to them. My way." Before Mason could stop her, she stepped outside into the moonlight. He cursed under his breath, covering her with his rifle as she walked calmly to the center of the clearing. There she knelt, removing items from the pouch: tobacco, some kind of herb, a small clay pipe. For several tense minutes, nothing happened. Then one by one, shadows detached themselves from the darkness. 7 Comanche warriors emerged, surrounding Nadua, but keeping their distance. Their leader, distinguished by the eagle feathers in his hair, approached her slowly. Mason kept his rifle trained on the leader finger, poised on the trigger. If this went wrong, he'd take down as many as he could before they reached the cabin. Nadua spoke in Comanche, her voice carrying clearly in the night air. The leader responded, his tone harsh. She answered, gesturing toward the dead scout, then to the sky, her voice rising with emotion. The warriors shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. The leader stepped closer to Nadua, reaching out to touch her face, as if confirming she was real. Then, to Mason's astonishment, the warrior knelt before her, pressing his forehead to the earth at her feet. One by one, the others followed suit. Nadua turned toward the cabin, beckoning Mason outside. Warily, he complied, rifle still ready. "What just happened?" he asked. "I told them who I am," she replied. "Not Rebecca Lawson, Nadua, daughter of Chief White Eagle, touched by Great Spirit. And they just believed you. They believed this." She pointed to a crescent-shaped birthmark at her temple, partially hidden by her hair. "Mark of Morning Star. Sacred sign among my band." The leader rose, studying Mason with open suspicion. Nadua spoke again in Comanche, gesturing between Mason and herself. Whatever she said caused the warriors to regard him with newfound, if reluctant, respect. "This is Bear Killer," she introduced the leader. "My brother." Mason lowered his rifle, inclining his head in greeting. "Your brother thought you were dead." "All thought I was dead," she confirmed. "Captured in raid 15 winters ago." Bear Killer spoke in halting English. "White man, save sister, why?" Before Mason could answer, the crack of a rifle split the night. One of the Comanche warriors fell, blood blooming on his chest. Another shot, and a second warrior dropped. "Ambush!" Mason shouted. pulling Nadua toward the cabin as Bear Killer barked orders to his men. They made it inside just as a fusillade of bullets splintered the doorframe. The remaining Comanche warriors scattered, returning fire from the cover of rocks and trees. Through the window, Mason glimpsed movement on the ridge. At least a dozen men, their positions betrayed by muzzle flashes in the darkness. He recognized the military precision of their deployment. "Jessup!" he growled, firing at a shadow moving between boulders. He used the Comanche scout as bait, knowing we'd investigate. Nadua crouched by the other window, Remington ready. Bear Killer and his men are trapped in crossfire. Outside, the battle intensified. The Comanche warriors fought with desperate courage, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. One by one, they fell to the ruthless efficiency of Jessup's men. A bullet shattered the window above Mason's head, showering him with glass. He returned fire, rewarded by a cry of pain from the darkness. "We can't hold them off for long," he said grimly. Nadua nodded, a decision forming in her eyes. "There is another way." She moved to the fireplace, pulling at a stone in the chimney that shifted under her hand. Behind it was a small cavity containing an oilskin packet. "Maps," she explained. "I hid them here years ago when I escaped first time." Mason stared in disbelief. "The Spanish maps were here all along. Cooper's cabin, built on old Spanish mission ruins. Place known only to my people." She pressed the packet into his hands. "You must take these to Judge in Austin. I will draw them away." "No," Mason said firmly. "We stick together." "They will kill you," she insisted. "Me, they need alive, for now." Another volley of bullets peppered the cabin. The door wouldn't hold much longer against a determined assault. "There's a trap door in the pantry," Mason said, remembering Cooper's map. "Tunnel leads to a cave system. We can both escape." Nadua shook her head. "Too slow with my wound. You go. I create distraction." Before he could argue further, a tremendous crash announced the door giving way. Mason fired blindly toward the entrance, forcing the attackers back momentarily. "Go!" Nadua pushed him toward the pantry. "Complete what we started." A smoke bomb sailed through the shattered window, quickly filling the cabin with choking fumes. Through watering eyes, Mason saw Nadua move toward the door, firing the Remington to cover his retreat. "I'll find you," he promised, voice rough from the smoke. "I know." She met his gaze one last time. "Honor demands it." The last thing Mason saw before descending into the tunnel was Nadua standing tall amid the smoke facing the door as Jessup's men rushed the cabin. The tunnel was barely wide enough for Mason's shoulders, forcing him to crawl through darkness thick as molasses. The Spanish maps were tucked securely inside his shirt, pressed against his skin. Above, muffled gunfire and shouts penetrated the earth, then silence more terrifying than the chaos that preceded it. Mason fought the urge to turn back. Nadua had made her choice, sacrificing herself so he could escape with the maps. Going back now would waste that sacrifice. Still, each foot of progress felt like betrayal. The tunnel opened into a natural limestone cave where Mason could finally stand. Faint light filtered through a crack in the ceiling, illuminating stalactites that hung like frozen daggers. Cooper's map showed the cave system extending for nearly a mile, with an exit in a dry creek bed to the north. Mason struck a match, consulting the crude drawing. 3 branching passages loomed ahead, each swallowed by darkness. He chose the leftmost tunnel, moving as quickly as the uneven ground allowed. His thoughts circled back to Nadua. She'd called him a man of honor in a land without it, as if it were a fatal condition rather than a virtue. Perhaps she was right. Honor had led him to protect her, and now she was captured. or worse, while he fled through the earth like a burrowing creature. The passage narrowed again, then abruptly widened into a second chamber. Mason froze. Light from a sputtering torch illuminated the cavern, revealing a makeshift camp bedrolls, ammunition crates, and half-eaten meals abandoned in haste. "Jessup," Mason muttered. The colonel had discovered the caves and used them as a forward base to ambush the cabin. A faint scraping sound came from a side passage. Mason extinguished his match, drawing his Remington as he pressed against the wall. Footsteps approached a single person moving cautiously. A figure emerged into the torchlight, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a Confederate officer's greatcoat that had seen better days. Colonel Jessup himself, alone, and seemingly unarmed. "I know you're here, Mason," Jessup called, his voice echoing off the limestone walls. "I've got men at both exits. There's no way out." Mason remained silent, calculating odds and distances. "The Comanche woman's been taken to Wade," Jessup continued, moving slowly around the chamber. "She's alive for now. Sullivan wanted to kill her after she shot 2 of his men, but Wade wouldn't allow it. Not until she reveals where the maps are hidden." Still, Mason waited, watching Jessup's movements. "I told Wade you probably have them now," Jessup said. "He's offering terms. Bring him the maps, and he'll let the woman go. You can both leave Texas with your lives and enough money to start fresh elsewhere." Like he let Peterson, Wilkins, and Taylor go, Mason finally responded, his voice hard. Jessup turned toward the sound, squinting into the darkness. "That was unfortunate. Wade acted without consulting me. Since when does a Confederate colonel take orders from a Union general?" "Since defeat changed the rules," Jessup replied bitterly. "The war's over, son. The South lost. Men like us have to adapt or perish. By betraying everything we fought for, what did we fight for?" Jessup demanded, sudden anger breaking through his composed facade. "Honor, glory, the Southern way of life," he spat on the cave floor. 20,000 men died at Gettysburg alone. For what? So Northern carpetbaggers could seize our land. So former slaves could become our masters. Mason stepped out of the shadows, Remington aimed at Jessup's chest. "We fought because we believed in something larger than ourselves, even if we were wrong." Jessup showed no surprise at Mason's appearance, only a weary resignation. "I believed too. Lost my son at Shiloh, my home to Sherman's troops, my dignity to surrender." His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of memory. "Then Wade offered me a chance to rebuild, to take back what was stolen from us. At the expense of people who had even less choice in their fate than we did," Mason said. "The Comanche didn't start the war that destroyed our world." "They're savages," Jessup dismissed. "They've been raiding settlements for decades." "After we stole their land," Mason countered. "Just like Wade's stealing it now." He gestured with his revolver. "On your knees, Colonel. Hands behind your head." Jessup complied slowly. "What now?" "You'll shoot an unarmed man, your commanding officer. You stopped being my commanding officer when you sided with Wade." Mason kept the Remington trained on Jessup as he retrieved a length of rope from the abandoned supplies. "I'm taking you to Austin. You'll testify about Wade's operation, the fake badges, the hangings, all of it." "I'll hang alongside him if I do that," Jessup said quietly. "Better than living as his attack dog." Mason bound Jessup's hands behind his back, then searched him thoroughly, finding a derringer hidden in his boot. "Where are your men positioned?" "North exit has 3. South has 4. Jessup studied Mason's face in the flickering torchlight. "You won't make it past them." "Then I'll make my own exit." Mason examined the chamber, noting a narrow fissure in the eastern wall where water had carved through the limestone. "Where does that lead?" "Nowhere," Jessup said too quickly. Dead end, Mason smiled grimly. Then you won't mind showing me. He forced Jessup to his feet and marched him toward the fissure. The opening was barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through sideways, but it widened slightly beyond the entrance. Mason lit another match, revealing a passage that sloped upward. After you, Colonel. Jessup hesitated, then entered the fissure with Mason close behind Remington, pressed to the small of his back. They ascended slowly, the passage growing steeper and narrower, until they were climbing almost vertically, Jessup struggling with his bound hands. How many men does Wade have total? Mason asked, helping Jessup over a difficult section. 30, maybe 40, Jessup replied. Former soldiers mostly, men who couldn't adjust to peace. And the Comanche trackers, hired through a Mexican intermediary. Wade offered them weapons and horses in exchange for finding the woman. The passage leveled out, briefly opening into a small chamber where moonlight filtered through a natural chimney above. Mason studied the opening, too narrow for a grown man, but the surrounding rock looked weathered and fragile. This is a waste of time, Jessup said, watching Mason examine the chimney. Even if you escape, Wade will find you. He's got men in every town from here to the Rio Grande. I'm not heading for the border, Mason said, gathering loose rocks. I'm going to Redemption. Jessup's eyes widened. That's suicide. Wade has something I want. Mason began stacking the rocks beneath the chimney, creating a makeshift platform. The woman, Jessup shook his head. She's probably dead already. Nadua's stronger than you think. Mason tested his weight on the rock pile, then started loosening the edges of the chimney with his knife. And even if she isn't, I made her a promise. Jessup watched Mason work, confusion evident on his weathered face. You hardly know her. Why risk everything for a Comanche woman? Mason paused, considering the question. Because she trusted me when she had no reason to. Because she fought beside me when she could have saved herself. He met Jessup's gaze. Because keeping your word still matters, even when the world's gone to hell. You sound like the old Mason, Jessup said quietly, the one who carried wounded men off the field at Antietam, even with Yankee bullets flying. I'm still that man. Mason returned to widening the chimney. Just took me a while to remember it. A chunk of limestone broke free, enlarging the opening enough that Mason could now see stars through the gap. He worked faster, sensing time slipping away. Nadua had been in Wade's hands for hours now. Whatever the general planned for her wouldn't wait on Mason's escape. You won't get her back alone, Jessup said, watching Mason's progress. Wade keeps her at his estate outside Redemption. It's fortified like an army post. I'm not going in guns blazing, Mason replied, breaking away another section of rock. I'm going to use these. He patted his shirt where the maps were hidden. Trading the maps for her life. Jessup nodded slowly. Might work. Wade wants those documents more than he wants revenge. The opening was now wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Mason tested its edges, ensuring they would hold his weight. Satisfied, he turned back to Jessup. I need to know I can trust you, Colonel. Jessup met his gaze steadily. You can't. I've already betrayed everything I once held sacred. Then consider this your chance at redemption. Mason cut the ropes binding Jessup's hands. Help me get Nadua back and testify against Wade. Make your next choice a better one than your last. Jessup rubbed his wrists, conflict written across his face. You're either the most honorable man I've ever known or the most foolish. Probably both. Mason holstered his Remington. What's it going to be, Colonel? Before Jessup could answer, voices echoed from the passage below. Wade's men, having discovered their absence from the main chamber. Jessup's expression hardened with sudden decision. "Go," he said, drawing the derringer Mason had returned to him. "I'll hold them here. Buy you time." "Colonel, don't waste it." Jessup cut him off. "Get to Redemption. Find the woman. Make this mean something." Mason hesitated only a moment before clasping Jessup's shoulder. "I'll see you in Austin." "No," Jessup said softly. "You won't." Mason climbed onto the rock pile and pulled himself through the opening, emerging onto a rocky slope, beneath a star-filled sky. Behind him, Jessup's voice rang out, challenging the approaching men. A single shot echoed through the chimney, followed by the thunder of multiple guns firing in response. Then silence. Mason stood still for a long moment, honoring Jessup's final choice. Then he oriented himself by the stars and began the long journey to redemption. Dawn broke over the rugged landscape, painting the limestone ridges in hues of gold and amber. Mason had traveled through the night, pushing himself beyond exhaustion, driven by the knowledge that each passing hour put Nadua in greater danger. He crouched behind a boulder overlooking a small ranch, watching as the occupants began their morning routine. A man emerged from the modest house, followed by a boy of about 10. They headed for the barn, likely to begin the day's chores. No women were visible, and no other men, just what Mason needed. He approached openly, hands visible Winchester slung harmlessly across his back. The man spotted him when he was 50 yards out, immediately pushing the boy behind him and drawing a revolver. "That's far enough, stranger," the rancher called. Mason stopped, removing his hat. "I mean no harm. I need a horse and supplies. I can pay." He held up a gold coin from Cooper's emergency cash. The rancher studied him suspiciously. "You're that Confederate Wade's men are hunting. Ridge, ain't it?" Mason tensed, ready to retreat if necessary. "You know Wade. Know enough to stay clear of him." The rancher lowered his gun slightly. "He foreclosed on 3 of my neighbors last month. Good men who just needed time after the drought." "I'm trying to stop him," Mason said. "He's taken someone important to me." The rancher seemed to make a decision. "Joseph," he said to the boy, "go fetch that bay gelding, the one with the white star." To Mason he added, "Horse isn't much to look at, but he's got heart. Won't quit on you." "I'm grateful," Mason said, approaching slowly. "I can pay double what he's worth." "Keep your money," the rancher replied. "Just make sure Wade gets what's coming to him." Within the hour, Mason was back on the trail, mounted on a sturdy bay gelding, with fresh provisions and, most importantly, clean clothes that wouldn't mark him as a fugitive. The rancher, who introduced himself only as Thomas, had even provided a battered old deputy's badge. "Found it after the previous sheriff disappeared," Thomas explained. "Might get you closer to Wade's place without raising alarm." Now, as Mason rode toward Redemption, he finalized his plan. Wade's estate lay 3 miles outside town, a sprawling ranch house surrounded by outbuildings and patrolled by armed guards. A frontal assault would be suicide. But Wade had a weakness: his reputation. The general had carefully cultivated his image as a respectable businessman, a pillar of the community. The Spanish maps threatened that image by exposing his land grab for what it was: theft on a massive scale. Mason would use that vulnerability. But first he needed leverage. Redemption appeared on the horizon by mid-afternoon, the church steeple visible first, then the 2-story buildings of Main Street. Mason approached cautiously, taking a circuitous route that brought him in from the west, away from the road where sentries might be posted. The town was busier than during his last visit, with wagons and riders clogging the streets. A banner strung across the main thoroughfare explained why: railroad celebration, groundbreaking ceremony tomorrow. Wade was moving faster than Mason had anticipated. With the railroad construction officially underway, The Spanish maps would become even more dangerous to the general's plans. No wonder he had intensified his search for Nadua. Mason rode slowly down a side street, deputy's badge, pinned to his vest hat, pulled low over his eyes. He headed for a small, weathered building at the edge of town, the newspaper office of the Redemption Chronicle. If anyone knew what was happening at Wade's estate, it would be the local newsman. The office was empty, except for a thin, bespectacled man hunched over a printing press. He looked up as Mason entered, eyes widening at the badge. "Can I help you, deputy?" "Taylor," Mason supplied, using the name from Cooper's forged papers. "Just passing through, looking for information on the railroad celebration." "Ah, yes." The editor relaxed slightly. "General Wade's crowning achievement. 15 miles of track connecting Redemption to the main Southern Pacific line will transform the whole county." "The general must be busy with preparations," Mason said casually, examining a stack of newspapers. "I heard he's hosting some distinguished visitors at his estate." The editor adjusted his spectacles nervously. "I wouldn't know about the general's personal affairs." "No, I thought the Chronicle covered all the important news in Redemption." "We print what we're permitted to print," the editor said, carefully glancing toward the door. "Perhaps you should speak with Sheriff Hayes if you need information about the general." Mason leaned across the desk, letting his coat fall open enough to reveal the Remington. "I'm looking for a Comanche woman brought to Wade's estate yesterday. Where is she being held?" The editor paled. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do." Mason's voice hardened. "Your newspaper office has a clear view of the main road. You see everyone who comes and goes." The man swallowed hard. "Please, Wade will kill me." "Wade isn't here," Mason pointed out. "I am." After a moment's hesitation, the editor broke. "There was a woman, native, brought in yesterday at sunset. She was unconscious or dead, I couldn't tell. They took her to the old mission north of Wade's ranch." He wiped sweat from his brow. "It's where Wade interrogates people. Nobody who goes there comes back." Mason felt ice form in his veins. "Is she still alive?" "I heard," the editor lowered his voice. "I heard they're waiting for her to recover enough to withstand questioning. Wade believes she knows where some valuable documents are hidden." Relief flooded through Mason. Nadua was alive, for now. "This mission," he pressed, "how well is it guarded? 2 men at the gate. More inside, probably, but tonight there will be fewer." The editor hesitated, then continued in a whisper. "Most of Wade's men will be in town for the celebration dinner. Even Sullivan is expected to attend." Mason straightened. "Thank you for your cooperation." "I didn't have a choice," the man replied bitterly. "Just like I won't have a choice when Wade asks who came looking for information." Mason considered this, then made a decision. He struck the editor with the butt of his Remington, hard enough to knock him unconscious, but not to cause serious injury. Then he bound and gagged the man, hiding him behind the press, where he wouldn't be immediately visible to a casual visitor. "Sorry," he muttered to the unconscious figure. "Better a headache than a bullet from Wade." Outside, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. Mason had a few hours until the celebration dinner would draw Wade's men away from the mission. He needed to use that time to prepare. He rode north out of town, keeping to less traveled paths. The mission came into view as he crested a low hill, a crumbling adobe structure with a bell tower that leaned precariously to one side. It had been built by Spanish missionaries in the previous century, abandoned during the Mexican-American War, and now repurposed for Wade's darker purposes. Mason dismounted, tethering the gelding in a grove of mesquite. Through his spyglass, he counted 2 guards at the main gate, as the editor had said. One more patrolled the perimeter, and smoke from the chimney suggested at least one person inside. Fewer than he'd feared, but still dangerous odds. As he studied the mission movement, caught his eye a rider approaching from the direction of Redemption. The man wore an officer's greatcoat, despite the Texas heat, and even at this distance Mason recognized the rigid posture. General Harrison Wade had come to personally oversee Nadua's interrogation. Mason watched as Wade dismounted at the gate, speaking briefly with the guards before entering the mission. His presence complicated matters significantly. Wade was no ordinary adversary. He was a skilled tactician who had commanded thousands of men during the war. He would have contingency plans for every scenario, including a rescue attempt. But his presence also created an opportunity. With Wade himself at the mission, Mason could potentially end this conflict in one decisive action: retrieve Nadua, secure the Spanish maps, and capture Wade for delivery to the federal authorities in Austin. The sun touched the horizon, shadows lengthening across the landscape. Mason used the fading light to move closer, belly crawling through the scrub, until he reached a position behind a crumbled section of the mission's outer wall. From there, he could hear voices from the interior courtyard. "She's still unconscious, General," a man reported. "Sullivan worked her over pretty good before we got here." "Idiot," Wade's cultured voice replied. "I need her coherent enough to answer questions. The railroad investors arrive tomorrow morning. I need those maps found and destroyed before they start asking uncomfortable questions about land titles." What about Ridge? Jessup was supposed to intercept him at Cooper's cabin. "Jessup failed," Wade said coldly. "His men found him dead in the cave system. Ridge escaped with the maps." "Then why are we still questioning the woman?" "Because Ridge will come for her," Wade answered. "He's predictably honorable, like all of Lee's men. When he does, we'll have both him and the maps." Mason's jaw tightened. Wade had anticipated his move perfectly. The mission wasn't just Nadua's prison, it was a trap set specifically for him. He retreated to reconsider his options. A frontal assault was now completely out of the question. He needed a diversion, something to draw Wade and his men away from Nadua long enough for Mason to get her out. As darkness settled over the mission, an idea began to form. Wade's obsession with the Spanish maps gave Mason leverage. The general believed Mason had the only copies, but what if he were to discover otherwise? Mason untethered the gelding and rode hard for Redemption. The celebration dinner would be starting soon, gathering the town's prominent citizens and most of Wade's men in one place. It was a risk, but Mason had run out of alternatives. The town blazed with lanterns when he arrived, the saloon and hotel especially bright. Mason dismounted in an alley behind the hotel, where tables had been arranged in the courtyard for the celebration dinner. Through a window he could see Wade's foreman Sullivan, his injured hand bandaged, holding court among several armed men. Moving stealthily, Mason approached the hotel's kitchen entrance. A harried cook was too busy directing his staff to notice as Mason slipped inside, making his way through the chaos to a service door leading to the main dining room. The room was filled with Redemption's elite businessmen, ranchers, and the town council, all gathered to celebrate the railroad that would make them rich. At the head table, an empty chair awaited General Wade's return. Mason spotted Sheriff Hayes near the entrance, his badge gleaming on his chest, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The sheriff's gun belt hung loosely, his attention on a young woman laughing at something he'd said. Moving quickly, Mason approached from behind. "Sheriff," he said quietly, "we need to talk. Outside." Hayes' stiffened hand moving toward his gun as he turned. Recognition flashed in his eyes, followed by alarm. "Ridge," he hissed. "You've got nerve showing your face here." "It's Deputy Taylor now," Mason replied, gesturing to his badge. Concerning those Spanish maps Wade's so desperate to find. Hayes's eyes narrowed. What about them? I've sent copies to the territorial governor and Judge Keller in Austin. Mason lied smoothly. Unless Wade releases the Comanche woman by midnight, they go public tomorrow morning. You're bluffing, Hayes said, but uncertainty tinged his voice. Care to bet Wade's future on that? Mason nodded toward the celebration. All these important people here to invest in a railroad built on stolen land. Imagine their reaction when they learn the truth. Hayes glanced around nervously. What do you want? Take a message to Wade. Tell him I'll trade the original maps for the woman. Midnight at the old hanging tree north of town. Mason stepped closer, voice hardening. And Hayes, if she's been harmed further, the copies go public regardless. Before Hayes could respond, Mason slipped back through the kitchen and into the alley. He mounted the gelding and rode north, not toward the hanging tree, but circling back toward the mission. Hayes would carry the message to Wade immediately. The general's absence from his own celebration dinner would be noted, but an urgent matter of business would provide a convenient excuse. Wade would assume it was a trap, of course. He'd send men to scout the hanging tree well before midnight. Finding nothing, he'd likely split his forces, some remaining at the mission to guard Nadua, others accompanying him to the meeting point. It wouldn't clear the mission entirely, but it might thin the opposition enough to give Mason a fighting chance. As he rode, Mason withdrew the Spanish maps from inside his shirt. The oilskin packet contained 3 yellowed parchments covered in faded ink boundary lines, landmarks, and Spanish text that Mason couldn't read. What mattered was Wade's belief in their power to destroy everything he'd built. Mason returned to his observation point near the mission just as riders emerged from the main gate, Wade himself leading 4 armed men toward redemption. That left perhaps 3 or 4 guards with Nadua. Better odds, if still dangerous. He waited until Wade's party disappeared into the darkness, then approached the mission from the rear, where the adobe wall had partially collapsed. The crumbling structure offered numerous handholds, allowing Mason to scale the wall and drop silently into the interior courtyard. A single lantern burned in what had once been the mission chapel. Mason crouched in the shadows, watching as a guard emerged from the doorway, stretched, and lit a cigarette. The man paced the courtyard once, then returned inside. Mason moved closer, pressing himself against the wall beside a window. Through the dirty glass, he could make out 2 guards playing cards at a table. Beyond them, a third man stood watch. Over a figure slumped in a chair, Nadua, her head, bowed wrists bound to the arms of the heavy wooden seat. Even from this distance, Mason could see the bruises on her face, the awkward angle of her bound hands. Rage flooded through him, hot and demanding. He forced it down, focusing on the tactical problem. 3 armed men between him and Nadua. No way to take them by surprise simultaneously. He needed to separate them. Mason retreated to the perimeter wall, searching until he found what he needed, a loose chunk of adobe about the size of his fist. He threw it hard against the far side of the courtyard, where it shattered loudly against stone. Voices raised in alarm inside the chapel. 2 guards emerged, guns drawn, moving cautiously toward the sound. Mason circled behind them, entering the chapel through the unguarded door. The remaining guard turned at his entrance, reaching for his pistol. Mason fired first, the Remington's report deafening in the enclosed space. The man crumpled, blood blooming on his chest. Nadua's head jerked up at the sound. Her face was a mask of bruises, one eye swollen shut, dried blood at the corner of her mouth. Recognition dawned in her good eye as Mason rushed to her side. "I told you to take maps to Austin," she whispered, voice ragged. I don't abandon my people, Mason replied, cutting her bonds with his knife. Can you walk? She nodded, though pain flashed across her face as circulation returned to her abused limbs. Wade will kill you. He'll try. Mason helped her stand, supporting her weight, as her legs threatened to buckle. We need to move. Now. Shouts from the courtyard indicated the other guards had heard the gunshot and were returning. Mason led Nadua toward a side door he'd spotted during his reconnaissance, praying it wasn't blocked. The door opened onto a narrow passage that had once connected the chapel to the missionaries' quarters. At the end, moonlight filtered through a collapsed section of roof. Mason helped Nadua navigate the debris, emerging onto a small rise behind the mission where scrub oak provided cover. My horse is hidden in those trees, Mason said, pointing to a mesquite grove 100 yards away. Can you make it? Nadua straightened, determination overcoming pain. Yes. They had covered half the distance when a shout rose behind them. A guard had spotted their escape and was raising the alarm. Mason turned, pushing Nadua ahead of him. Keep going, he ordered, raising the Winchester to his shoulder. I'll cover you. He fired twice, forcing the pursuing guard to dive for cover. More men emerged from the mission, spreading out to flank them. Mason retreated backward, firing methodically to keep the pursuers at bay while Nadua reached the trees. A bullet whined past his ear. Then another tore through his coat sleeve. Mason returned fire until the Winchester clicked empty. Cursing, he switched to his Remington, continuing the fighting retreat. He was nearly to the trees when white-hot pain lanced through his thigh. His leg buckled, sending him sprawling into the dust. The wound was high on his leg, dangerously close to the femoral artery, blood already soaking his trousers. Mason! Nadua's voice came from the darkness among the trees. Go! He shouted, dragging himself toward cover as bullets kicked up dirt around him. Take the horse, head for Austin. Instead, she emerged from the shadows, Remington in hand. With shocking precision, she fired 3 times, dropping the closest pursuers. Then she was beside him, lifting him with strength that belied her size and injuries. Together, or not at all, she said grimly, half-dragging him toward the gelding. Somehow, they reached the horse. Mason, lightheaded from blood loss, struggled to mount. Nadua practically shoved him into the saddle, then climbed up behind him, taking the reins. Hold on, she commanded, kicking the horse into motion just as another volley of gunfire erupted behind them. They galloped into the night pursuers close behind. Mason clung to consciousness, aware that the maps were still tucked inside his shirt, that Nadua's arms encircled him as she guided the horse, that his blood was leaving a trail any tracker could follow. We'll never outrun them, he managed through gritted teeth. Not both of us. On one horse. We don't need to outrun them, Nadua replied, steering the gelding up a rocky slope where pursuing riders would be forced to slow. Only reach redemption. Mason's fog-clouded mind struggled to follow her logic. Redemption, Wade's men. Control the town. But not all of it, she said cryptically. As they crested the rise, Mason glimpsed lights in the valley below. Redemption still bright with celebration. Nadua urged the exhausted gelding forward, descending toward the town by a winding path that kept them hidden from their pursuers. Instead of entering Redemption proper, she guided them to its outskirts, where scattered shacks housed the town's Mexican and Negro populations. Here the celebration lights didn't reach, and darkness provided cover as Nadua reined in before a small adobe structure. She dismounted quickly, helping Mason down. He sagged against her strength, fading as blood continued to seep from his wound. Nadua pounded on the door, calling out in a mixture of Spanish and Comanche. The door opened, revealing an elderly Mexican woman who gasped at the sight of them. She ushered them inside, barring the door behind them. Graciela, Nadua explained to Mason as the woman helped him to a pallet in the corner. Healer, friend to my people. Graciela was already examining Mason's wound, speaking rapidly in Spanish. Nadua translated. Bullet is still inside. She must remove it. Mason nodded weakly. Do what you have to. The next moments blurred in a haze of pain as Graciela extracted the bullet using a knife heated in the fire. Mason bit down on a leather strap, refusing to cry out, despite agony that threatened to tear him apart. When darkness finally claimed him, he surrendered to it gratefully. He awoke to find Nadua sitting beside him, her bruised face washed clean, a fresh bandage around her ribs visible beneath a borrowed blouse. Outside, dawn was breaking golden light, filtering through the single window. How long? He croaked, throat desert dry. Many hours, she replied, helping him drink from a clay cup. Wade's men searched the town but did not come here. They fear Graciela's reputation as a bruja, a witch. Mason attempted to sit up, gasping as fire shot through his leg. The maps are safe, Nadua assured him, pressing him gently back down. Rest. Heal. No time, Mason insisted. Wade's groundbreaking ceremony today. Once the railroad construction begins officially, those maps won't matter anymore. Understanding dawned in Nadua's eyes. We must stop the ceremony. We must expose Wade, Mason corrected. In front of the investors, the town, everyone. He reached inside his shirt, withdrawing the oilskin packet. These are our only leverage. Nadua took the maps, examining them with a reverence that spoke of their significance to her people. My father died protecting these, she said softly, as did many others. I'm sorry, Mason said, recognizing the weight of her loss. She met his gaze, resolution hardening her features. Their deaths will have meaning if we use these to stop Wade. Mason nodded, wincing as he shifted position. The ceremony will be held in the town square at noon. Every important person in the county will be there. You cannot walk, Nadua pointed out. And I am a Comanche woman. They will shoot me before I speak a word. Mason smiled grimly. Then we'll need help from someone they will listen to. The door opened as Graciela returned carrying fresh bandages and herbs for Mason's wound. Behind her came another figure, tall, white-haired, with the dignified bearing of authority. Judge Isaiah Keller, federal circuit judge for the Western District of Texas, had arrived in redemption. Judge Keller, Mason breathed, unable to hide his surprise. How did you— Your friend Cooper sent a telegram before his establishment was burned to the ground, the judge replied, his voice deep and measured. Said I should expect trouble in redemption. His keen eyes took in Mason's wound and Nadua's bruised face. I see he wasn't exaggerating. Nadua stepped forward, regarding the judge warily. You are man of law, white man's law. Federal law, young lady, Keller corrected, which is supposed to protect all citizens, regardless of color. He turned back to Mason. Cooper's message mentioned Spanish land grant documents. I assume those are what General Wade is so desperate to acquire. Mason nodded. Nadua has them. They prove Wade's railroad will cross tribal lands protected by treaties that predate American ones. The judge extended his hand toward Nadua. May I? After a moment's hesitation, she handed over the oilskin packet. Keller examined the contents carefully, his expression growing grave as he studied the faded Spanish text and boundary markers. These are authentic, he confirmed. Spanish land grants from 1795 establishing protected territories for Comanche Apache and other tribes in exchange for peace with colonial settlements. He looked up, eyes sharp beneath bushy white brows. "Where did you find these?" "They were entrusted to my father," Nadua replied, "hidden when raiders attacked our village. I alone survived who knew their location." Keller nodded solemnly. If these were presented in a federal court, they could invalidate much of Wade's land acquisition. The railroad would be blocked until tribal negotiations were completed. He refolded the maps carefully. No wonder he wants them destroyed. "And he'll succeed, unless we stop the groundbreaking ceremony today," Mason said, struggling to sit up despite the pain. "Once construction officially begins, these become just historical curiosities." "You're in no condition to attend a public ceremony," Keller observed dryly. "I don't need to be there," Mason replied. "You do." Understanding dawned in the judge's eyes. "You want me to halt the proceedings on legal grounds." "Wade respects power," Mason said, "and he's careful about his public image. He won't risk opposing a federal judge in front of railroad investors and the town elite." "It's risky," Keller mused. "Wade has considerable influence even over federal appointees. I could find myself reassigned to Alaska if I cross him without sufficient cause." "These maps are sufficient cause," Nadua insisted. "They show truth of what was stolen." Keller studied her intently. "Young woman, I've spent 40 years enforcing laws that have not always served your people well. I cannot undo that history with one action." "No," she agreed. "But you can stop one more injustice today." The judge was silent for a long moment, weighing the maps in his hands, as if measuring their historical weight against his own conscience. Finally, he nodded. "Very well. I'll need these documents, and I'll need witnesses." He glanced at Nadua. "Including you, though appearing in public, puts you at considerable risk." "I will speak for my people," she said firmly. "It is why I survived when others did not." "And I'll be there too," Mason insisted, attempting again to rise. "You'll tear that wound open if you try to stand," Keller admonished. "Besides, Wade's men will shoot you on sight." "Wade believes I have the only copy of the maps," Mason argued. "He won't risk killing me until he's sure he has them." "He already has Nadua to use as leverage against you," Keller pointed out. "Not anymore." Mason looked at Nadua, a silent understanding passing between them. "We stick together from now on." Graciela, who had been quietly preparing medicinal herbs in the corner, spoke rapidly in Spanish. Nadua translated. "She says there is a way you can attend without walking." She gestured to a narrow cart used for transporting goods to market. "Graciela will disguise you as her sick husband." Mason grimaced. "Not very dignified." "More dignified than bleeding to death in the town square," Keller noted dryly. They spent the next hour preparing. Graciela dressed Mason's wound with herbs that dulled the pain, then helped disguise him with a broad-brimmed hat and serape that concealed his features. Nadua donned a simple dress and shawl borrowed from Graciela, pulling her hair back in the style of Mexican women. Keller would approach the ceremony openly as himself, his position as federal judge providing protection. Wade wouldn't dare breach publicly. He would carry the Spanish documents, revealing them only at the critical moment. As they finalized their plans, a sudden commotion outside drew their attention. Graciela peered through the window, then spoke urgently to Nadua. "Wade's men are searching house to house," Nadua translated. "They grow closer." "We need to move now," Keller decided. "The ceremony begins in less than an hour." With Graciela's help, they transferred Mason to the cart, covering him with blankets and baskets of herbs. The pain nearly overwhelmed him, but he bit back his groans, knowing their lives depended on maintaining the deception. Nadua took the handles of the cart, while Graciela walked beside it, maintaining the illusion of a family heading to market. Keller departed separately, taking a direct route to the town square where his official appearance would cause no suspicion. They moved slowly through the winding alleys of Redemption's Mexican Quarter, avoiding the main streets where Wade's men would be watching. Mason, peering from beneath the blankets, saw the town transformed. Banners celebrating the railroad hung from every building. Crowds gathered, dressed in their Sunday-best excitement, palpable in the air. The town square had been decorated for the occasion. A wooden platform stood at its center, chairs arranged for dignitaries. Behind it, a symbolic section of railroad track had been laid, complete with a golden spike, waiting to be driven home. General Wade himself stood on the platform, resplendent in a tailored suit, greeting arriving investors and town officials. Mason scanned the crowd, identifying Wade's men positioned strategically throughout. Sullivan stood near the platform, his bandaged hand a testament to their previous encounter. Sheriff Hayes lounged nearby, thumbs hooked in his belt, eyes constantly roving. "Too many guards," Mason murmured, as Nadua paused the cart in the shadow of a building overlooking the square. "They'll spot us before we get close enough." "We need distraction," Nadua agreed, eyes darting over the crowd. As if in answer to their need, a commotion arose at the far side of the square. A group of riders approached, Comanche warriors, 7 or 8 strong, led by a tall figure wearing eagle feathers. "Bear Killer," Nadua whispered, recognition and shock mingling in her voice. "My brother." The crowd parted fearfully as the Comanche warriors entered the square. Wade's men moved to intercept them, hands on weapons, but Wade himself raised a hand, stopping them. Whatever threat these Comanche posed, the general preferred to handle it without violence that might disrupt his carefully orchestrated ceremony. Bear Killer dismounted, approaching the platform with the dignity of his position. Though Mason couldn't hear the exchange, it was clear the Comanche leader was making some formal statement or demand. Wade listened with the practiced patience of a politician, his smile never reaching his cold eyes. "Now," Mason urged, "while they're distracted." Nadua pushed the cart forward, Graciela walking alongside, blending with townspeople, moving toward the ceremony. They circled the edge of the crowd, approaching the platform from the side opposite the Comanche delegation. Judge Keller stood nearby, watching the exchange between Wade and Bear Killer with intense interest. He caught Mason's eye briefly, giving an almost imperceptible nod. The judge began moving toward the platform, timing his approach to coincide with theirs. They were 20 yards from the platform when disaster struck. Sullivan, scanning the crowd, spotted Nadua despite her disguise. Recognition flashed across his face, followed by alarm. He grabbed the arm of a nearby guard, pointing directly at them. "Now or never," Mason muttered, throwing off the blankets and struggling to rise from the cart. The sudden movement sent fire through his wounded leg, but determination pushed him forward. He drew his Remington from beneath the serape, keeping it concealed as he leaned heavily on Nadua. Sullivan was pushing through the crowd toward them, drawing his pistol. Several of Wade's men followed their approach, hampered by the press of bodies. Mason and Nadua reached the edge of the platform just as Judge Keller ascended the steps from the other side. "General Wade!" Keller called out, his authoritative voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "I must interrupt these proceedings on a matter of federal jurisdiction." Wade turned surprise, briefly breaking his composed facade. "Judge Keller, this is unexpected. I wasn't aware you had business in Redemption." "Legal matters concerning land rights relevant to your railroad project," Keller replied, withdrawing the Spanish documents from inside his coat. "These Spanish land grants, predating American territorial claims, establish protected tribal territories directly in the path of your proposed line." Wade's smile tightened. "An interesting historical curiosity, Judge, but surely not relevant to modern development." "On the contrary," Keller said, The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo specifically upholds Spanish land grants made prior to American acquisition of these territories. The crowd's attention was now fully on this unexpected confrontation. Even the Comanche delegation turned to observe Bear Killer's eyes widening as he spotted his sister at the edge of the platform. Mason and Nadua used the distraction to climb the platform steps. Pain threatened to buckle Mason's leg with each movement, but Nadua supported him, her strength belying her small frame. Wade spotted them as they reached the platform. "Ridge," he hissed, recognition turning to fury. "This is your doing." Mason raised his voice to address the crowd. "General Wade has been acquiring land through fraud and intimidation, knowing all along that much of it legally belongs to the Comanche under treaties that the United States government is bound to honor." Sullivan reached the platform, gun drawn. "General, give the word, and I'll end this interference right now." Wade hesitated, acutely aware of the investors and dignitaries watching. Violence would confirm Mason's accusations more effectively than any document. "Stand down, Sullivan," he ordered quietly. "Let's not give them martyrs." Judge Keller spread the Spanish maps on the ceremonial table, inviting the railroad investors to examine them. "These documents will be filed with the federal court in Austin tomorrow," he announced. "All land transactions based on disputed territories will be suspended pending review." Wade's face darkened with barely suppressed rage. "Those papers are forgeries," he declared, "part of an elaborate scheme by Confederate sympathizers to undermine progress and prosperity." "They are authentic." Nadua stepped forward, her voice carrying across the suddenly hushed square. "I am Nadua, daughter of White Eagle Chief of the Northern Comanche. These lands were promised to my people by the Spanish crown in exchange for peace. That promise was inherited by the Mexican government and then by the United States." Bear Killer moved to stand beside his sister, the other Comanche warriors following. The symbolic power of their unified presence was not lost on the crowd. Wade tried another approach. Even if these documents were once valid, the Comanche violated peace terms repeatedly through decades of raids on settlements. Any claim they might have had is nullified by their actions. "Those raids were responses to encroachment on lands guaranteed by treaty," Mason countered. "The same lands you've been seizing through foreclosures and falsified deeds." Murmurs spread through the crowd as townspeople and investors alike began to grasp the implications. Wade's carefully constructed image was crumbling before their eyes. "This is absurd," Wade blustered. "Sheriff Hayes, arrest these people for disrupting a lawful assembly." Hayes hesitated, looking from Wade to Judge Keller, clearly uncertain whose authority prevailed. "I wouldn't advise that, Sheriff," Keller said mildly. "Interfering with a federal judge in the performance of his duties carries serious consequences." The sheriff's hand dropped from his gun. "Sorry, General. Not getting involved in a jurisdiction dispute." Wade's control over the situation was slipping away. The railroad investors huddled together, conferring in low, concerned voices. The town council members looked uncomfortable, avoiding Wade's gaze. Even his own men seemed uncertain, watching for clear direction that wasn't coming. In desperation, Wade made his final play. He strode to Mason, lowering his voice so only those on the platform could hear. "You think you've won Ridge, but you've merely postponed the inevitable. The railroad will be built. Progress cannot be stopped by ancient papers or savage claims." His eyes burned with cold hatred. "And when the dust settles, I'll still be here with all my power and influence intact. You'll be a forgotten footnote if you're even alive." Mason met his gaze steadily. "Perhaps, but today you lose." Wade's composure finally cracked. With a snarl of rage, He drew a derringer from his vest pocket and lunged at Mason. Nadua cried out in warning, trying to intercept him, but Wade was too quick. The small pistol pressed against Mason's chest, Wade's finger tightening on the trigger. The shot that rang out came not from Wade's derringer, but from the edge of the crowd. Wade staggered, a look of confusion crossing his face, as he looked down at the spreading crimson stain on his immaculate white shirt. He turned slowly, searching for his assailant. Standing at the rear of the crowd was a tall figure in a dust-covered Confederate greatcoat, left arm hanging uselessly at his side. Colonel William Jessup lowered his smoking revolver, face grim beneath the shadow of his hat brim. "For Peterson, Wilkins, and Taylor," Jessup said, voice carrying in the sudden silence. "And for the honor you made me betray." Wade collapsed to his knees, the derringer falling from his nerveless fingers. His eyes found Mason's shock and disbelief written across his features. "You Confederate trash," he gasped. "This changes nothing. It changes everything," Mason replied quietly. The general toppled forward, blood pooling beneath him on the platform. For a moment, the entire square stood frozen in Tableau Wade's body. At the center, Mason and Nadua beside him, Judge Keller, with the Spanish documents, the Comanche delegation standing tall and proud, and Jessup, the unlikely executioner, already being surrounded by stunned townspeople. Then chaos erupted. Women screamed, men shouted, and Wade's men reached for their weapons, unsure who to target in the confusion. Sullivan raised his gun toward Mason, only to find Bear Killer's knife suddenly at his throat. "Enough!" Judge Keller's voice cut through the pandemonium. "Sheriff Hayes, restore order immediately." Hayes, seeing which way the wind was blowing, seized the opportunity to preserve his position. "Everyone stay calm," he shouted, moving to take charge. "This is now a federal matter." Mason sagged against Nadua, the adrenaline that had kept him upright finally ebbing. His wounded leg would no longer support him, and darkness threatened at the edges of his vision. "We did it," he murmured. "Yes," she replied, easing him into a chair. "But at what cost?" Mason looked to where Jessup was being restrained by townspeople. The colonel stood stoically, making no attempt to resist or escape. Their eyes met across the distance, a lifetime of shared history passing between them. Jessup gave a small nod, the gesture carrying both acknowledgement and farewell. The scene blurred as Mason's consciousness began to fade. The last thing he saw was Nadua's face above him, concern in her dark eyes, her lips forming words he could no longer hear. Mason awakened to the rhythmic creaking of wagon wheels and the gentle sway of motion. He lay on a pallet of blankets, a canvas awning shielding him from the sun. His leg throbbed dully, but the fiery pain had subsided to a manageable ache. "He wakes!" Nadua's voice came from nearby. Mason turned his head to see her sitting beside him, wearing traditional Comanche clothing, once more her hair in a single braid down her back. The bruises on her face were fading to yellowed shadows. "Where are we?" he asked, voice rough from disuse. "Traveling north," she replied, "to Comanche winter grounds." She offered him water from a canteen, supporting his head as he drank. "You have been fevered for 3 days." Memory returned in fragments, the confrontation with Wade Jessup's unexpected intervention, the chaos that followed. "What happened after I passed out?" "Much confusion," she said. "Judge Keller took control. Railroad men left town quickly when they learned truth about land. Wade's men scattered without their leader. And Jessup," sadness flickered across her face. "He surrendered himself. Judge took him to Austin to stand trial." Mason absorbed this, a complex mixture of emotions churning within him. Jessup had betrayed everything they once stood for, yet, in the end, he had chosen honor over survival. He'll hang for murder. Perhaps, Nadua acknowledged, but he dies with honor restored. Mason attempted to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at his healing wound. With Nadua's help, he managed to prop himself against the side of the wagon. Beyond the canvas covering, he could see they were part of a larger procession, several wagons and dozens of mounted Comanche moving across rolling grassland. "Your people accepted you back," he observed. "I am Nadua, daughter of White Eagle," she said simply. "The morning star has returned." "And they accepted me?" Mason asked, genuinely surprised. A smile touched her lips. "Bearkiller says any man who fights Wade and lives must have strong medicine. Others agree." Her expression grew more serious. Judge Keller also helped. He spoke to tribal council about the maps, promised new treaty negotiations, said you were friend to Comanche. Mason looked out at the procession again, noting how the warriors rode alongside families, children laughing from wagon beds, elders seated with dignity despite the rough journey. It was not the fearsome war party of frontier legend, but a people in migration, carrying their lives and traditions with them. "What happens now?" he asked. "We winter in Protected Valley," Nadua explained. "When you are stronger, we travel to Austin. Judge Keller arranges meeting with Governor about new boundaries." She hesitated, then added, "After that, you choose your path." The implication was clear. She would not assume his choice would include her or her people. Despite everything they had shared, the gulf between their worlds remained. Mason reached for her hand, his calloused fingers closing around hers. "My path is already chosen," he said quietly. "If you'll have me." Nadua's dark eyes studied him, searching for certainty. "Your world will not accept such a choice." "My world died at Appomattox," Mason replied. "I've been looking for a new one ever since." She was silent for a long moment, the wagon creaking beneath them as it rolled northward. Finally she said, "Comanche have saying, when warrior takes new path, he does not look back at old one." "I've nothing to look back for," Mason assured her. "You have son," she reminded him. Mason stared at her in shock. "What?" "Judge Keller told me. Your son lives with your former wife in San Antonio." Nadua's expression was gentle but firm. "This I learned while you were fevered. You must go to him when you are healed." The revelation struck Mason like a physical blow. James alive. After all these years believing him dead. I don't understand. Emma told me he died of the fever. Judge says she feared for boy's safety in harsh land you chose. Took him away, told you he died, so you would not follow. Mason struggled to process this information, emotions he had buried for years, surging to the surface. Grief, anger, hope, confusion. Why would Keller tell you this, and not me? He tried. You were unconscious. Nadua squeezed his hand. He left letter for you. Said choice was clear, find your son. "And what about us?" Mason asked suddenly, fearful of losing what they had barely begun to build. Nadua's face softened. "I will wait one full cycle of seasons. If you return, we build new path together. If not..." She shrugged, a gesture that belied the emotion in her eyes. "Then you have found where you belong." Mason pulled her closer, ignoring the pain in his leg. "I'll find him," he promised. "And then I'll return. To you." But she rested her forehead against his, their breath mingling in the intimacy of the moment. "This is good," she whispered. "The law of the frontier is not just survival. It is finding where you truly belong." As the wagon train continued northward across the vast Texas landscape, Mason held Nadua close, watching the horizon unfold before them. For the first time since Gettysburg, the future held more promise than shadow. His son was alive. The woman beside him had awakened something he thought dead within him. And somewhere ahead lay the possibility of a life reclaimed from the ashes of war. The path would not be easy. Cultural barriers, lingering prejudices, and the harsh realities of frontier life would test any bond. But Mason had survived a war that tore a nation apart. He had faced down men like Wade, who would build empires on others' suffering. Surely he could forge a new life that bridged the worlds he and Nadua came from. As if reading his thoughts, Nadua said, "Bear Killer says you must learn to hunt Comanche way when your leg heals. No more loud rifle shots that scare all game away." Mason chuckled. "I suppose I could learn to use a bow." "Yes," she agreed with mock seriousness. "Though your arms are weak like old woman's." He laughed outright, the sound startling him with its unfamiliarity. How long had it been since he'd truly laughed? Since before the war, perhaps. The wagon crested a rise, revealing a vast valley spread below a river winding through it like a silver ribbon. Comanche riders galloped ahead, whooping with the joy of approaching home. The winter encampment would be established along that river, sheltered by cottonwoods and limestone bluffs. For now, it was enough. The maps were safe with Judge Keller Wade's empire was crumbling, and Mason had found something he never expected, a future worth fighting for. His son waited in San Antonio, a meeting that would require every ounce of courage he possessed. But first he would heal among these people who had accepted him, despite every reason not to. "Tell Bear Killer I accept his challenge," Mason said, watching the valley draw nearer. "I'll learn to hunt the Comanche way." Nadua smiled, the expression transforming her face. "Good. Then I will teach you to speak properly, so you do not sound like Grunt Grunt Bear when you talk to elders." As the wagon train descended toward the valley, Mason realized that the law of the frontier was not what he had always believed, not merely survival of the strongest or fastest. It was finding where you belonged, even if that place existed between worlds. It was standing for what mattered even when the cost was high. And it was building something new from the ruins of the old. With Nadua beside him and the promise of his son in the future, Mason Ridge, former Confederate soldier, grieving widower, and reluctant hero, finally found the peace that had eluded him since the first shot at Fort Sumter. The frontier had nearly killed him, but in the end, it had given him back his life. 6 months passed, like a slow-moving river carving new channels through familiar landscape. The Comanche winter encampment, nestled in the sheltered valley, had become a place of healing for Mason, not just for his leg, which now bore a puckered scar where Sullivan's bullet had torn through muscle and scraped bone, but for wounds far older and deeper. The morning dawned clear and cold, his breath visible in the early light as he emerged from the lodge he shared with Nadua. Frost painted the grass silver, and the river ran dark between banks, stiffened with winter. Mason wore buckskin pants and a heavy wool shirt beneath a worn cavalry coat, a blending of his past and present that mirrored the man himself. Bear Killer approached, leading 2 horses, his own painted war pony, and a sturdy buckskin mare that had become Mason's mount. The Comanche warrior's face remained stern, but his eyes held the respect earned through months of shared hunts and councils. "Today you leave," Bear Killer said, in the halting English he had practiced for this moment, "to find sun." Mason nodded, accepting the reins. "I'll return before the summer moon." Perhaps Bear Killer's expression revealed nothing. Or perhaps white man's world claims you again. "My world is where I make it," Mason replied. The warrior studied him, then reached to his belt and drew a knife, not his own prized blade, but one crafted specifically for this moment. The handle was antler-polished smooth, with bands of intricate beadwork. The blade gleamed in the morning light, its edge honed to razor sharpness. "For journey," Bear Killer said, presenting it hilt first. Brother should not travel empty-handed. Mason accepted the gift with proper solemnity. "I am honored." "Honor is earned." Bear Killer clasped Mason's forearm in the warrior's grip they now shared. "You fought for my sister when her own people would not. You bled for maps that protect our hunting grounds. The council has spoken. You are Tassatuut Wolf who stands alone. No longer enemy, but brother." The formal naming took Mason by surprise. He had lived among the Comanche through the winter, learning their ways, joining their hunts, but had never expected to be granted a place within the tribe itself. "I will carry the name with honor," he said, the Comanche words coming more naturally after months of practice. Bear Killer nodded once, then turned as Nadwa approached, leading her own horse. She wore traditional Comanche dress, her hair braided with shells and beads that marked her status as daughter of a chief. Around her neck hung a medallion, Spanish silver, one of the few artifacts salvaged from her childhood. "The council waits," she said. "They would speak with you before you depart." Mason followed her to the center of the encampment, where 7 elders sat in a semicircle around a small fire. Their faces, weathered by decades of sun and wind, revealed nothing as he approached. He had learned that Comanche formality masked emotions that ran as deep as any white man's, perhaps deeper. The oldest among them, a man called Silent Hawk, whose clouded eyes had witnessed nearly 80 winters, spoke first. Through Nedwa's translation, he addressed Mason directly. "You go to find your son. This is good. A warrior must know his blood." The old man's gnarled hands gestured toward the distant horizon. "But the white man's world remembers you as enemy to Wade. His friends seek vengeance." Mason nodded. "I am prepared for that risk." "Are you prepared for your son to reject you?" another elder asked. "To choose the life he knows over a father who appears from shadows?" The question struck home, piercing Mason's carefully constructed confidence. In truth, he had avoided confronting this possibility that his son, now nearly 12, might want nothing to do with the father he had been told was dead. "I cannot force him to accept me," Mason admitted. "I can only offer him the truth." Silent Hawk nodded, apparently satisfied. "Truth is good beginning." He turned to Nadwa. "And you, Morning Star, you will guide this wolf to San Antonio, and then return." Nadwa's chin lifted slightly. "I will guide him, yes. My return depends on what we find." A murmur passed through the elders. One spoke sharply in Comanche, clearly objecting to her implied willingness to remain in the white world. Nadwa responded with equal force, words flowing too rapidly for Mason to follow. The exchange ended with Silent Hawk raising his hand for silence. "The council has decided," he announced. "You both travel with our blessing, but also our warning. The world beyond our hunting grounds grows more dangerous for our people, not less. The railroad is delayed, not stopped. Wade is dead, but others take his place." His clouded eyes seemed to focus directly on Mason. Judge Keller sent message. "The trial of Colonel Jessup begins when moon is full. Your testimony may be required." Mason tensed. He had known this was coming, yet the reality of facing Jessup again, this time across a courtroom rather than a battlefield, filled him with unease. The colonel had saved his life by killing Wade, but justice demanded accountability for that act. "I will speak truth when called," Mason promised. Silent Hawk nodded once more. "Then go with our protection. The spirit of White Eagle watches over his daughter and her chosen warrior." The blessing concluded the council. As Mason and Nadua prepared to depart, members of the tribe approached with small gifts for their journey: dried meat, a water skin decorated with protective symbols, a pouch of medicinal herbs. The gestures moved Mason deeply, reminding him how far he had come from the solitary, bitter man who had once hidden himself away in a lonely cabin. Their final farewell came from Bear Killer, who would lead the tribe in their absence. "Return if you can," he told his sister, embracing her briefly. "If not, know your people remember." To Mason, he said simply, "Protect her among your kind, as she protected you among ours." "With my life," Mason promised. They rode out as the sun cleared the eastern ridge, following the river south toward San Antonio. 4 days' hard riding lay ahead through territory that grew progressively more settled as they approached the city. Mason felt the change with each mile, the wild frontier giving way to fenced pastures and plowed fields. The open sky somehow diminished by the encroaching civilization. Nadua rode beside him, her posture revealing none of the apprehension she must feel. She had not ventured into a major settlement since her escape from Wade's captivity, and San Antonio would be hostile territory for a Comanche woman regardless of her connection to Mason. "You don't have to come all the way," he said as they made camp the first night. "I could continue alone once we reach the outskirts." Nadua looked up from the small fire she was building. "Would you leave me if our positions were reversed?" "No." "Then do not ask me to leave you." She arranged kindling with practiced efficiency. "Besides, your son should know all of who his father is, now including me." Mason nodded, acknowledging the wisdom in her words. If he truly intended to build a life that bridged his past and present, hiding Nadua from James would be the worst possible beginning. They traveled steadily southward, avoiding major trails and settlements where possible. On the third night, as they camped in a secluded grove near a creek, Nadua grew unusually quiet, her gaze fixed on the stars emerging in the darkening sky. "What troubles you?" Mason asked, sitting beside her on a fallen log. She was silent for a long moment. "I have never told you of my time with the Lawsons," she finally said. "The missionary family that raised me. You said they gave you a white name, white God, white ways." "Yes?" Her voice was distant, remembering. "Thomas Lawson found me after raiders attacked our village. I was 8 winters old, the only survivor. He believed God had spared me so I could be civilized." The word carried a trace of bitterness. "I fought at first, tried to run away. They were patient but firm. Said my soul depended on forgetting my heathen past." Mason listened, understanding this was a rare glimpse into the years that had shaped her. "They taught me to read, to write, to speak proper English," she continued. "Mary Lawson showed me how to sew, to cook their food, to behave as a proper lady. They truly believed they were saving me." Her fingers traced the silver medallion at her throat. "I hid this, my only connection to my father. When they found it, Thomas wanted to destroy it. Mary convinced him to let me keep it as a memento of my rescue." "Did you hate them?" Mason asked quietly. "At first, yes." Nadua's eyes remained on the stars. "Later, no. They were kind in their way. They believed what they taught. When fever took them, I grieved truly." She turned to Mason. "But I never forgot who I was born to be. Even when I could no longer speak my language, even when I dressed and acted as Rebecca Lawson, something inside remembered Nadua." Mason took her hand, understanding the complexity of her experience in a way few others could. "You've lived in both worlds. That's why you understand mine." She nodded. "And why I fear San Antonio. There I must be Rebecca again to avoid danger. Yet that name now feels like another's skin." "You will always be Nadua to me," Mason promised. Whatever name you use with others. Her fingers tightened around his. And you, will you be Mason Ridge the Confederate or Tassatu Ut, the adopted Comanche? Both, he answered truthfully. And neither. I'm something in between now. She smiled faintly. As am I. Perhaps that is why the spirits brought us together. They rode into San Antonio late on the fourth day, dust-covered and weary. The city sprawled along the river, a bustling mix of Mexican adobe buildings and newer American structures. Street lamps were being lit as they entered, casting pools of yellow light on cobblestone streets, crowded with wagons, riders, and pedestrians. Mason had arranged for them to stay with an old comrade from his unit, Michael Donovan, who had settled in San Antonio after the war, and now ran a modest livery stable. Donovan had responded to Mason's letter with an immediate offer of lodging and assistance, asking no questions about the Comanche woman traveling with him. The livery was located on the edge of the business district, a well-maintained establishment with a small house attached. Donovan himself emerged as they rode into the yard, a barrel-chested Irishman with a shock of red hair now streaked with gray, and a beard that couldn't quite hide the scar running from ear to chin. "Mason Ridge, as I live and breathe," Donovan's voice boomed across the yard. "Thought you'd disappeared into the wild for good." Mason dismounted, embracing his old friend with genuine warmth. "Came close to it, Mike." Donovan stepped back, taking in Mason's appearance. The buckskin pants, the beaded belt, the subtle changes in bearing that came from months among the Comanche. "Life on the frontier suits you better than that haunted look you carried after Appomattox." His gaze shifted to Nadua, who remained mounted, watching the exchange warily. "This is Nadua," Mason said simply. "My companion." If Donovan was surprised by the nature of their relationship, he hid it well. "Ma'am," he said with a respectful nod, "welcome to my humble establishment. Any friend of Mason's is welcome here." Nadua inclined her head slightly, her posture relaxing marginally at his acceptance. She wore a plain dress over her Comanche garments, her hair tied back beneath a shawl, disguise enough for a brief ride through town, though not for extended interaction with San Antonio society. Donovan led them inside the small house where his wife Martha, a practical-looking woman with kind eyes, had prepared a hot meal and heated water for bathing. She welcomed Nadua without hesitation, offering clean clothes and a private room for washing away the dust of travel. When they were settled around the table with plates of stew and fresh bread, Donovan broached the subject of Mason's quest. "I made inquiries as your letter requested," he said, keeping his voice low despite the privacy of his home. "Emma lives on the north side of town in a fine house on Cypress Street. Her husband, Charles Barton, is a successful merchant, imports, exports, that sort of thing. Respectable fellow, by all accounts." Mason absorbed this information, trying to imagine his former wife in this new life. "And my son, the boy attends St. Mary's School. Bright lad, according to my sources. Goes by James Barton now." Donovan hesitated. "Mason, you should know he believes his father died at Gettysburg. Emma has constructed a narrative for him." "What kind of narrative?" Mason asked, tension evident in his voice. "That his father was a Confederate hero who died saving his commanding officer." Donovan's expression was sympathetic but direct. "The boy honors your memory. It won't be easy for him to learn you're alive after believing otherwise for most of his life." Mason set down his fork, appetite gone. "I need to see him first, before approaching Emma." "I've arranged that too," Donovan said. "The school has recess in the churchyard at midday. You can observe from across the street without being noticed." Nadua, who had been silent during this exchange, spoke quietly. Will you tell him everything about the war, about Wade, about us? I don't know, Mason admitted. I only know I can't live with myself if I don't try to be part of his life. That night, as they prepared for bed in the small guest room Donovan had provided, Nadua noticed Mason's restlessness. He stood at the window, staring out at the city lights, fingers absently tracing the scar on his thigh. You fear tomorrow, she observed. Not fear, he corrected. Uncertainty. I've faced men with guns and felt more prepared than I do for seeing my son. Nadua came to stand beside him, her presence steadying. When I was taken from my people, I remembered my father's words. A warrior's strength is not in never falling, but in rising each time he falls. Your son has your blood. He will understand this, even if not immediately. Mason turned to her, cupping her face gently in his calloused hands. What did I do to deserve your wisdom? You listened when others would not, she said simply. You saw me when others looked past. They held each other through the night, finding comfort in shared warmth, as they had so many times in the Comanche winter camp. Tomorrow would bring challenges neither could fully prepare for, but they would face them together. Two survivors who had found in each other the strength to begin again. The morning dawned clear and warm, spring having arrived earlier in San Antonio than in the northern plains. Mason dressed with unusual care in clothes borrowed from Donovan, a clean shirt, dark trousers, and a vest that concealed his revolver. He could not bring himself to wear a tie, that final symbol of civilization's constraints. Nadua wore the dress Martha had provided, though she kept her medallion visible at her throat. Her hair remained in a single braid, a compromise between her heritage and the need to blend in. She would accompany Mason as far as the church yard, then wait at a nearby cafe while he observed his son. They walked through the busy streets, Mason increasingly tense as they approached St. Mary's. The church rose before them, its stone tower reaching toward the cloudless sky. Adjacent to it stood the school, a two-story brick building with large windows through which children could be seen at their lessons. That's it, Mason said, voice tight. Recess will be in an hour. They found the cafe Donovan had recommended, taking a table near the window with a clear view of the schoolyard. Nadua ordered coffee, though she preferred the strong tea of her people. Mason could eat nothing, his stomach knotted with anticipation. What will you do if he looks exactly like you? Nadua asked. The question startled Mason. I haven't thought about that. Donovan said Emma created story of hero father. If son sees himself in your face, the truth becomes harder to deny. Mason considered this. When I left for the war, he was too young to remember me clearly. But children see more than we give them credit for. The hour passed with excruciating slowness. Finally, a bell rang from the school, and children spilled into the yard like water from a broken dam. Boys in dark trousers and white shirts. Girls in simple dresses, all suddenly free from the constraints of the classroom. Mason leaned forward, scanning the faces, searching for features that might echo his own. Then he saw him, a tall, slender boy of about 12 with dark hair and a serious expression that broke into a smile as he joined a game of marbles with several other boys. James, Mason whispered, recognizing his son instantly, despite the years that had passed. The boy had Emma's delicate features, but Mason's build and coloring. He moved with a confidence that reminded Mason painfully of himself at that age. Nadua watched Mason's face, witnessing the complex emotions playing across it. He is strong, she observed. Healthy. They have cared for him well. Mason could only nod, words failing him, as he watched his son laugh, argue a point about the game, then concede with good-natured grace when overruled. In those simple interactions, he saw hints of the man James would become. I can't approach him here, Mason finally said. Not with other children around, not until I've spoken with Emma. Nadua nodded. Wise choice. The boy should not be caught between mother and father in public place. They watched until the bell rang again, and the children reluctantly returned to their studies. Mason remained at the window long after James had disappeared inside, as if hoping for one more glimpse. "He's alive," he said, wonder in his voice. "All these years, I thought—" "Now you must speak with his mother," Nadua reminded him gently, "before you approach the boy." Mason turned to her, sudden doubt clouding his features. "What right do I have to disrupt his life? He's happy, well cared for. He believes his father died a hero." "Truth is always right," Nadua said firmly. "Even difficult truth. My people believe a lie eats the spirit from inside like worm in apple. The boy deserves to know his father lives." Her certainty steadied him. "Then we go to Emma now, before I lose my nerve." The Barton residence stood on a tree-lined street of substantial homes, evidence of Charles Barton's success in business. A wrought-iron fence surrounded a well-tended garden, and lace curtains hung in the windows of the two-story brick house. Mason paused at the gate, a flood of memories threatening to overwhelm him. The last time he had seen Emma was before his final deployment to Virginia, their parting strained by the war's toll on their marriage. She had been unable to understand his need to fight for the Confederate cause, and he had been unable to explain it in terms that satisfied her. "Would you prefer I wait elsewhere?" Nadua asked, sensing his inner conflict. Mason shook his head. "No, Emma should meet you, should understand what my life has become." He opened the gate and approached the front door, each step feeling heavier than the last. Before he could knock, the door opened, revealing a maid in a starched apron. "May I help you, sir, ma'am?" she inquired, her curious gaze taking in Nadua's distinctive appearance. "Please tell Mrs. Barton that Mason Ridge would like to speak with her." Mason said, his voice steadier than he expected. The maid's eyes widened slightly. "One moment, sir." She disappeared into the house, leaving them waiting on the porch. Mason fought the urge to flee, to return to the simplicity of the Comanche camp, and forget this painful resurrection of his past. Only Nadua's presence beside him kept him anchored. The door opened again, and Emma stood before them, still beautiful at 36, her golden hair now styled in a mature coiffure, her figure fuller than he remembered, but elegantly dressed in a blue day gown. She stared at Mason as though seeing a ghost, one hand flying to her throat. "Mason," she whispered. "Dear God." "Hello, Emma," he said quietly. "May we come in? There's much to discuss." For a moment, he thought she might refuse, might slam the door and deny his existence as she had for so many years. Then, with visible effort, she composed herself. "Of course," she said, stepping back to admit them. "Sarah, please, bring tea to the parlor." The maid hurried away, clearly eager to escape the tension crackling in the air. Emma led them to a well-appointed sitting room, gesturing for them to be seated, while she remained standing as if unwilling to commit to a prolonged conversation. "I thought you were dead," she said without preamble. "After you disappeared into the frontier, there were rumors. Comanche attacks, outlaws." Her gaze shifted to Nadua, taking in her appearance with barely concealed shock. "I nearly died several times," Mason acknowledged. "But as you see, I survived." Emma's composure cracked slightly. "Why are you here, Mason, after all these years?" "I know about James," he said simply. "I know you told him I died at Gettysburg." Color drained from Emma's face. She sank onto a nearby chair, fingers clutching its ornately carved arm. "How?" "Judge Keller in Austin. He learned the truth during his investigation of Harrison Wade." Emma's eyes widened at the name. "Wade? What does that monster have to do with you? A great deal, Mason replied grimly. But that's not why I'm here. He leaned forward, his gaze intent. Why, Emma? Why let me believe our son was dead? Tears welled in her eyes, though her voice remained steady. You were broken after the war, Mason. Bitter, angry, determined to exile yourself to the most dangerous territory you could find. What kind of life was that for a child? That should have been my choice to make, Mason said, anger finally breaking through his careful control. He was my son, too. And what would you have done? Emma demanded. Dragged him to that God-forsaken cabin of yours, raised him with nothing but your nightmares and your guns for company. She shook her head fiercely. I did what any mother would do. I protected my child. The painful truth of her words struck Mason silent. Would he have been a fit father in those dark years after Appomattox? Could he have provided James with anything resembling a proper upbringing? Nadua spoke into the tense silence. Your fear was understandable, she said to Emma, her accented English drawing the woman's startled attention. But child has grown. Man before you now is not same man you feared. Emma studied Nadua with newfound curiosity. And you are Nadua, she replied simply. I am with Mason by choice, as he is with me. Understanding dawned in Emma's eyes. I see. She turned back to Mason. You've built a new life. I'm glad for you truly. But James has a father. Charles has raised him as his own. He's a good man, a loving father. I don't doubt that, Mason said. But James deserves to know the truth. Not some fiction about a hero who died at Gettysburg, but the reality of a father who has searched for him since learning he's alive. Emma was silent for a long moment, internal struggle evident in her expression. Finally, she sighed. What exactly do you want, Mason? To meet my son. To be a part of his life, if he'll have me. And if I refuse? Her voice held a note of steel beneath the genteel exterior. Mason met her gaze directly. Then, I'll petition the court for visitation rights. I'd rather not put James through that, but I will if necessary. The threat hung in the air between them. Emma's face paled, then flushed with anger. You would drag our son into a legal battle, subject him to public scrutiny and gossip. I would prefer your cooperation, Mason replied. But I will not walk away from my son again. Before Emma could respond, the front door opened and closed, followed by a boy's voice calling, Mother, I'm home early. Sister Margaret sent us away because of the broken pipe. Emma froze, panic flashing across her features. Mason stood, heart hammering in his chest, as footsteps approached the parlor. James appeared in the doorway, school books clutched against his chest, his young face curious at finding visitors with his mother. His eyes swept over Mason without recognition, then widened slightly at the sight of Nadua, clearly intrigued by her exotic appearance. James? Emma said, her voice strained. I wasn't expecting you until later. The boy stepped into the room, his gaze returning to Mason with growing interest. Who's this mother? Emma hesitated, trapped in the moment she had dreaded for years. Mason held his breath, waiting for her decision, knowing it would shape everything that followed. Finally, Emma straightened her shoulders, facing the inevitable with the courage he had once admired in her. James, she said softly, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you long ago. She gestured for her son to sit beside her. This is Mason Ridge. She took a deep breath. He's your father. End of the law of the frontier.